Hi, I'm Matt Hall with the MSU Center for Community Economic Development, and today I'm going to be having a conversation with Paul Hickman of Urban Ashes. So, Paul, would you like to tell us a bit about yourself?
That's a, as I said, it could be a long conversation here, but we'll try to keep it as short as possible. Um, in the context of Urban Ashes or the work I'm doing right now, originally I went to school for fine art back in the '80s, and actually got my degree in art and spent 15 years or so in the scenic arts industry doing restaurant retail interior work, and did that up until I was doing a lot of stuff with the Barbie and Disney galleries for Mattel, a lot of really fun stuff, but a lot of the stuff didn't make sense to me, particularly in the materials and the products it was selling. So in about the mid 90s, I started looking for some alternatives to the furniture I'd been making on the side. I got my degree in fine art, but it was installation, basically installation art. And so I started doing furniture in the early 90s and doing gallery pieces and commission pieces. And by the mid 90s, I started looking for alternative materials that I could control for that, and discovered this is relatively new internet. Originally, I was getting wood out of buildings in St. Louis that were being deconstructed on the riverfront from the 1800s. I was living in Chicago at the time and was getting some antique poplar out of there. Discovered a lot of organic finishes that have been around for thousands and thousands of years, like just simple things like milk paint that are in the Egyptian tombs. Really, ultimately, what it did is it search around on the internet. I discovered a lot of this was really focused out on the West Coast, out in the Bay Area, San Francisco, Berkeley, a little bit up in Seattle as well, but mostly in the Bay Area. And so I ended up quitting my job and kind of went on a journey to bury myself in the green building movement out in California. This is about 97, 98, and moved out there and ended up taking a job as a forklift driver at EcoTimber, which at the time was still a pretty young company that had started by three guys to really prove that sustainable lumber was a viable business. These guys predated FSC certification, and I learned an incredible amount from them. And pretty quickly, I didn't last on the forklift very long. I don't know if it was my driving or maybe I was worth better somewhere else, and ultimately took over the retail sales manager position and got a massive education. I was a big giant sponge in this whole new world of sustainable wood, certified wood, urban salvage wood. It introduced me to urban salvage wood. Ultimately got me involved in working on LEED certification specs pre-LEED. This is 98, 99 on some of the original committees, developing the specs for LEED. And I'm still not certified for whatever that's worth. And it buried me really in with some of the pioneers in the entire country are out there, whether that's in straw bale or bamboo or IAQ, things like that, and how critical all that is to the built environment. And looking at the recycled content, to the air quality, to the sustainability of the materials, are they fossil fuel based, all of those things. So I spent 3 years out there with a massive education involved in that.
I see. And so now that you are back in Michigan, you've started to establish yourself a bit in the community. That was when you started working with the Urban Wood Project, right? Can you tell us a little bit about the Urban Wood Project?
Yeah, so around 2002, the Emerald Ash Borer was, well, I think they knew it was here for longer, but it was announced that it was here in Southeast Michigan, came in through Detroit. And ultimately, they Detroit and Cleveland, but they identified the first one or tagged it in Canton, Michigan. And so we were seeing all these ash trees by like 2004, 2005, looking at all these ash trees coming down, thousands and thousands of them all over the place, literally in your front yard. My yard and my apartment at that time, I think we lost 3 ash trees just right in front of our apartment. So myself and 3 other people that I've been doing some work with on green building certification got together to try to put together a network of mills to utilize these ash trees beyond mulch, because that's what they were doing with all of them at that time. And so we created the Urban Wood Project in 2005. I hadn't seen I got introduced to urban wood out in California in the late 90s, but it was pretty much an unknown factor, at least around here. I really didn't see much else on the internet outside of California. There may be some small things going on around the rest of the country. But we started that, and we started selling lumber at the Reuse Center here in Ann Arbor. as the Urban Wood Marketplace. And that continued to grow every year. The core person that really worked with us was Jessica Simons, who was definitely the heart and soul spreading the gospel of urban wood, would be pretty apropos description of the work she did. And by 2009, the sales of the wood had been continuing so much, or growing so much. Jason and I, who was one of the other guys that started it as well, got together and said, well, let's come up with a product we can scale. And that's, where we were standing in a line for a concert for Loudon Wainwright. And he said, let's come up with a product we can scale. And he threw out some ideas on how the labor force should work and things like that. So that sort of started a whole new direction for me, I guess.
Right. And that was the beginning of Urban Ashes, right?
Correct. Yeah, that was September of 2008 when that conversation happened. By April 4th of 2019, officially launched Urban Ashes. What I settled on, actually, Jason looked at me and said, you're the designer, you got to come up with the product, you got to scale. And I had actually been doing some work with my son, Charlie, who was the one we moved back here, and my other son, Joe. Well, actually, he wasn't quite born yet. He ended up in the business later, but we were doing these collaborative prints where, we were doing these prints and we were doing some of our own frames. And I thought, okay, this is relatively straightforward. We can do some frames. I think that would be a good way to showcase the unique characteristics of wood or the urban wood. And then Jason had thrown out on the labor side, he said it needs to be manufactured with transitional and disabled labor. I had no idea what transitional labor was. I could figure out what disabled was. Transitional labor, when he said it, I always say, I really thought he was talking about day labor. It was terminology a little bit used, and the language has changed a lot over the years. And really what he's talking about is returning citizens, folks that have been formerly incarcerated, coming out trying to find jobs, and the difficulties that they run into. And so that's what I focused on with the business, was launching a picture frame manufacturing company that diverted urban salvage and deconstructed wood from the landfills, mulch pile, burn piles, while employing returning citizens. And then a little bit later, we added youth that had contact with the criminal justice system. So we kind of added that in as well.
Yeah. And so obviously, starting a business is a lot of trial and error and things like that. So from the beginning, from that conversation and from those first few frames, how did Urban Ashes grow and develop over time? What needed to change, and where are you guys now?
Well, the first 3 years, I really spent, while I continue to do my own design business, I spent 3 years doing R&D and also developing the labor structure, the infrastructure, how to build this. When we launched, I wanted to make sure we had a really high quality product. And I think we did a really good job with that. And I also, because of the labor side, I really didn't know that much about. And it took me a while to really start to understand that. And that's still an ongoing process. It's a very unique two sets of populations that have incredible challenges. I often say they're the most discriminated against individuals trying to find employment in the country. There's often completely unfounded lack of empathy to them, which is crazy. And the more and more I worked with these folks side by side, day by day, that became what I was most interested in. And I had one of my guys talk to me relatively early on. Well, it was maybe 3 or 4 years in. He was our very first employee, a guy named Calvin Evans. And I asked Calvin at one point, I said, at what point did you start trusting me that this was, real, that I'm not out here using you guys or whatever? And his response was, as soon as you started bringing your kids into the shop and letting your kids work with us, then I knew you were for real, that you trusted us. And then because it's a major trust issue with a lot of these individuals because of the situations they've been through. Talking about some serious PTSD even before they went into prison. They're coming out of war zones and neighborhoods that have been completely left behind or really set up to fail. And then they're in a prison environment that is literally another planet with a whole different culture, different language, and they're coming out, and even with their best intentions, learning a whole new society is a massive challenge. So anyways, you asked me how we evolved. In 2012, we grew out of Washtenaw County finally, and by the end of 2012, we were in about 175 states, or excuse me, 175 locations in about 25 states. And then the next year we continued to grow, and with it by about 2015, we were in 43 states and 260 retail locations where we didn't own we're selling to retailers, mostly custom picture frame shops, but also gift boutique stores. We started developing product lines specifically for other companies, which I refer to as OEM, kind of the equivalent of, if you think of a car, a lot of people don't understand what OEM is, and depending on what industry they're in. But if you buy a new car, the tire, you buy a Ford and the tires on the car are Goodyear tires. Those Goodyear tires are OEM. They're original equipment manufactured, is supplied on there. So we were making picture frames for other people that, like for example, maybe this poster behind me where they put out 10,000 of those posters and they need frames. We would supply them the frames, they'd drop the posters in and sell them. And that's where we really grew to up until 2019. But so because of when I started in 2009, I didn't know what a social enterprise was. I didn't know what a triple bottom line business was. L3Cs didn't exist in Michigan. I didn't even know what one was. And I didn't know much about this labor force. I knew a lot about the wood, but I'm basically bringing a whole bunch of different things that would be a challenge for any one of them to add to a business. And I had a handful, and we were able to basically figure them all out. And it was it was a for-profit social enterprise. We could got to this one plateau, and we couldn't get quite over to the next hump for a multitude of reasons, scaling from a really small shop up to a big shop. And with all these kind of disparate entities involved, it just became ultimately too much of a challenge. We almost got bought out a couple times by a couple different companies. And so what I decided to do at the end of 2018, early 2019, is basically I needed to shut down the shop and kind of look at how to restructure this. And because it was too hard to do with a functioning business, trying to keep that going day to day. I couldn't step back enough to really figure out what the next step was, because my whole goal was always to divert as much wood from the landfill as possible, or burn pile, mulch pile, and employ as many people from these two pools. And I wanted to really look and see what was the best way for me to have the highest impact on that. And a relatively small, even a big picture frame company, you're only going to hire a few hundred people. So I started looking at other alternatives on what to do and what the evolution of Urban Ashes could be, because we had built such a highly recognizable brand in the picture framing industry, but also in furniture and a few other things. So how can I leverage that is where it went to next.
And we've spoken a bit about your most recent project, the Ford VPEC Vehicle Performance Electrification Center. And so I was hoping that you could walk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, so I was reached out by the general contractor actually about 5 years ago, somewhere around 2016, I think, and maybe 2017. And they reached out to me. They were building a new project or two new facilities out in Allen Park, outside of Detroit, where they were going to be clearing 13 acres, and Ford Land had given a directive to utilize those trees to their highest capacity. And so they reached out to the Urban Wood Project initially, and came across Urban Ashes, and they said, hey, we want to do this. We don't know how to do this. It looks like there's a lot of things involved in this. Can you help us? And I said, initially I thought about it. I was like, well, it's really not in our immediate wheelhouse, but all the components, I work with all the components every day. And said, absolutely. So let me look at it, and bringing together all our whole supply chain and everything. It's really the same thing. And went out there and met with them and looked at the logs, though we didn't come in. It would have been a little better if we come in a little bit earlier, because the logs were already down at that time. And it's ideal moving forward with any other project like this is to get whether it's Urban Ashes or somebody else, whoever's facilitating this, out there in the beginning before trees come down. So you can identify, tag trees, explain to the whoever, the tree service, the excavation company that's bringing them down, where to cut them, how to bring them down, how not to trash them and drag them through the mud and get rocks in them, and grading them, which ones are ideal for what they want to use. Decide kind of in advance roughly what you want to use them for, so you can tag this stuff and it becomes a whole lot more efficient. You're not just grabbing everything, throwing it in a big pile, and then trying to sort it out later, which is kind of what we did on that one. It's a challenge. But ultimately we did it, and we're able to figure out what we wanted to use it with. Then we selected all the trees. We took 2 semi-loads of trees off the property. It was all kiln dried. It was all slab first, then kiln dried, then processed into the raw materials. We produced multiple large conference tables at roughly 9 feet by 24 feet, and 3 large wood sculpture walls in the 2 main lobbies that were designed by the architect. But in both cases, you're working with them to explain to them what are the limitations or features that you have to deal with urban wood, to make sure that they understand, what they're dealing with. It's a little different than traditional wood. What the timelines are like, when the kiln drying process, it's not just walking in and ordering lumber off the rack. This is literally from tree to table, and there's a lot of steps in between, and making sure some of them are long. Kiln drying can take up to months, and you got to make sure that you plan for that. And that's what we did with VPEC. And then it was a little bit of a learning curve, and it's a lot about education and explaining to everybody, both in the case of Ford, their design teams, whether it's the architects or their in-house designers, and work with them. And we're actually now starting to potentially be working on the Michigan Central project with them too. So you invest this in the front end, and hopefully the education component gets smaller and smaller as you move forward. But that's a big part of it. With Urban Ashes, what I looked at is, like I said, I basically put all of these pieces in place that I needed for Urban Ashes. Some of them didn't exist, some did, but they were very disparate. It's like, all right, now how do I take that and keep them all tied together and apply it to somebody else's business and help them tap into all of those that I spent years building? And that's what I wanted to do with the VPEC project. And then again, moving forward, we're also looking at a project with Ann Arbor and Washtenaw County, developing a circular urban wood, what I'm calling now a trichotomy, that is basically built out of triple bottom line businesses. So it's my new spin on sort of taking individual triple bottom line businesses, network them together, and now you have a full-on trichotomy. And this is built around urban wood utilization. And this can be for like VPEC. The VPEC project is a perfect one with corporations that have large tracts of land that they're responsible for. It's things that they can bake into their sustainability plans, that they can capture the carbon and document it. We can provide them with all that. It helps them meet goals that they have set in-house. It also helps create a story back to the space. Just all the people that I saw, even just like the workers there, see, wow, this wood came off the property and it's back here again, and that's pretty cool. And so they've got that story to continue to tell. As soon as you even walk in the door, these big sculpture walls, they're big ISO lines, which are the lines that they kind of show going over cars in a wind tunnel. It's a wind tunnel facility there. And they're putting a Ford GT up against the wall, and this wood is curving and going up over them, and is pretty cool. And it all came off. It lived on that property, and it's now still living there, and it's still captured large numbers of carbon, and keeping it right there. And so it's not just thrown up into the atmosphere.
Absolutely. Well, Paul, thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. I think there's a lot to be learned, or at least to be looked for, definitely, from this story and from the evolution of Urban Ashes over the years. So I appreciate it very much.
Thanks for your time. Take care.